Yellow everyone, it's your favorite night out here, out on this unfortunately sunny day. Before we get started, video is not sponsored by anyone. So, this is purely a project of my own. We are not sponsored by any brand names that may or may not be mentioned or viewed within this video. Fantastic. Alrighty then, let's get on with it, shall we? This is about general public perception when it comes to the idea of civic defense, which can be in three distinct categories I've conceived for this video, just to kind of make it organize the video a little better. There is the general Western cultural perception of the militia, and on top of that, there is the national, which can apply to any country, and the local, which of course can apply to any country. Now we're going to start, though, with the furthest, that might be from the furthest of your concern, but is actually very, very important to understand for the rest of this series and this video. And that is that at the end of the day, there is a general cultural perspective in the West which is inherently negative towards the idea of civic defense and the militia when it's not convenient to a national interest at the time. And what it generally boils down to is, it's a very hot and humid day, my apologies, and well, boils down to is, over time, as professional militaries developed, many Western countries, if they maintained militias, generally would put like the bare minimum to call them I won't even call them effective force, but generally a force under arms that could serve as a reserve for the state. This means they generally tended to be of lower quality. On top of that, there's generally a poor perception of mercenaries, even when at times they were of superior quality to some national militaries. So this all comes together and affects the rest of this video. And this negativity is generally born of that lower standards militias generally got kept to, even though historically many militias were kept to very, very high standards of training and equipment and performed very well in many a conflict. A fine example of a national militia or civic defense force would be in the past, we're moving back a little ways, would be like the Roman Republic when it was fighting Carthage. And on top of that, a national militia can be trained to the same level and receive the same level of equipment as a professional military. It just takes the country wanting to do that. Many are not, because many see essentially the militia in modern Western countries the same way a aristocrat would view a peasant's levy. Something expendable, there for an emergency to fill gaps in the line. So generally they don't put much effort into it. Now, this does generally affect things. On top of that, due to the lower quality standards, militias tend to misbehave as well, historically, and national militaries would do that as well, but generally, militias would be ridiculed more readily than, say, a professional military for that, especially if the professional military won the conflict. Yeah, if you win the conflict, you don't really got to worry about things like war crime trials. And, well, this moves on to national perspectives, which is inherently connected to the international perspective in Western cultures, but the national perspective applies to any culture. Many cultures, if you are an independent individual creating your own little civic defense group or militia, will generally speaking really not appreciate that. Nothing scarier to a bureaucrat that's used to being in charge than the chance that to be polite, the help can potentially instigate a successful armed revolt. Very scary to a bureaucrat. Very scary to a social elite. So they tend to frown upon that quite a bit. And when you're used to being in charge, you don't like the fact that someone could, end that little gravy train of yours. Then there's also the fact that, due to the fact that they are not under state supervision, there's not a, the oversight comes down to the willingness of that specific group. And if that specific group isn't willing to keep itself to a high standard, you're going to end up one that has training and equipment equivalent to a professional, highly trained force, and then you're going to have those that are not. In fact, probably really bad. And this just kind of feeds into what, generally speaking, would be seen on the local level and the local perceptions. Because the state will criticize, by default, any sort of civic defense unless the state ideologically supports the idea, which is very, very rare because no one wants their gardener, if they forget to pay them, a little bit too much during a period of an economic downturn, joining some group, and then next thing you know, they're storming the proverbial palace. Generally not a fun time for many people who are fond of authority. Dark jokes aside, moving on. I do apologize, I had to brush something out away. And, well, at the end of the day, on the local level, this will be amplified. If the state doesn't approve, the state's going to slander. And many people will buy whatever the slander is at the time. So it doesn't matter how pure your intentions is, there's going to be people in the community that just flat out do not trust anything you have to say at all. It doesn't matter how pure your intentions are. It doesn't matter if your whole group is made up of paragons of virtue and, zeal for wanting to be as neutral as possible in that community while providing maximum protection. The moment you get arms and training involved, there's going to be people in your community who are like, no, definitely not. Big no, no. And that's because there is a legitimate concern that one day you'll be like, bye. Or just generally decide that since they are one of the less than desirable members of the community, it'd be okay to pick on them a little. Go take their stuff, maybe, because you need some, call it, for the greater good, or whatever it is you want to call it at the time. Or whoever, because maybe you're pure, not everyone in your group's necessarily going to be. And the people who aren't going to be may lie to you. Because they may go do something and then lie to say, hey, insert title of whoever's in charge, that person either agreed to give it to me and is now lying, or, they started it. Or if it was just a general dispute. However, they could be lying to you, and you have to trust the person. You either have to trust the person who's probably made it clear they disapprove of whatever it is you're doing, or one of your own. A lot of people will choose their own, and a lot of people are aware you're likely to choose your own. And that's generally going to turn many people away. So, on top of that, you have a history of militia being seen as poorly trained. You have a history of them being abused. You have history of, just general political distrust of anything to do with some sort of armed civic defense that is not controlled by the state. And your civic defense will, by default, depending on the political circumstances, will generally always have a potential for it to start an internal conflict, because the groups that don't trust you in your community may start their own, and anything that happens that deteriorates relations going straight down is going to lead to conflict. And since everyone's armed and has varying degrees of training, that generally doesn't end well for the peaceful individual who wants to live peacefully and wants to live neutrally in their house. And that's another reason why many people will reject the idea. And it's just something inherent. Yes, some communities will be fine with it. Others won't be. A lot of them will be in the middle. And that middle ground is where conflict is going to inevitably develop, even if it remains just argumentative in the community. And nothing more serious than maybe, say, someone filing a complaint. Now, anything you say or do, or things don't work out for you, is going to be used against you locally, and then, if the state doesn't approve, by the state. And many people, I get it, will argue that doesn't matter. It's the right thing to do. And, I'm not yay or naying it myself. I believe in the idea of an armed citizenry. I believe in the old ideals of having an armed citizenry. So for me, there are inherent responsibilities you have to keep. We'll make a video on that. I will make a video on that after this series, as I want to do this back to back. And generally speaking, the perception in modern society, and anyone who has strong self-preservation instincts, is not going to favor someone they have disputes with in the past, politically disagree with, or maybe religiously disagree with, forming an armed and trained group. That's not going to sit well with a portion of society. You say, well, I have the majority, so that there ain't nothing that can do with that. It is real easy to talk someone into going from community protector to community oppressor. And if you think the threat of armed force of someone disagreeing with you won't make them feel threatened, you haven't thought things through. I'm not saying yes or no. If people meet, from my perspective, the old ideals of an armed citizenry, then I have no problem with it. However, I do recognize some of the inherent issues to the concepts and the perception and how things generally get implemented. Now, this gone on for like 12 minutes, and it's a bit of I do have a habit of rambling. Alrighty then. Like, share, and subscribe. I appreciate any feedback, positive or negative. Leave it in the comments section. Feel free to subscribe. This is part of a series. I normally do game videos, but I do these IRLs on the weekend. Well, that's the point. That's what I'm eventually going to do. With a periodic passion project that might, be on a weekday. And alrighty then. All the pleasantries aside, I guess I'll be seeing everyone around. Toodles!